This is an exciting video for me. First of all, the reason we do these videos is because you guys ask a lot of questions via email, online, Twitter, you name it, and we try to get them to the right people, or at least the ones who are excited to talk about it. And I'm definitely excited to talk about this one because it has to do with a tale of two Broncos. Ta-da! Now, when I refer to Broncos, I'm not referring to the Bronco Sport, which is a crossover-based SUV that's coming out soon. We'll get to that though a little bit later. I am talking about the brand new Ford Bronco, and I'm also talking about a Bronco people have forgotten about, the Ford Bronco II. That's right, the Bronco II. The stars have aligned, and more than one question has come to me very recently about the Ford Bronco II, which is cool. So the first one is from, it's actually on Twitter, and it's to Nathan Adlin at Twitter. And he's asking if the Bronco II is a good collectible vehicle. It's an interesting question. Before I answer that, let's talk about the Bronco II and why the Bronco II has a fairly close connection to the brand new Bronco that's about to come out. The Bronco II went into production in 1983 as a 1984 model, and it lasted until about 1990. Now, during that time, it sold fairly well, and it was built to sell specifically against vehicles like the Jeep Cherokee and the Chevy Blazer S10. They all had very similar mission statements in terms of what they were, off-road vehicles that you could drive every day. The Ford Bronco II was based almost entirely on Ford Ranger components, but it had a much smaller wheelbase. In fact, amongst all the vehicles it competed against, it was one of the smallest wheelbase vehicles out there at the time, about the equivalent of a Jeep Wrangler at the time. Very small wheelbase, very narrow wheelbase, and a very tall little truck. We'll get to that in a second. So this little truck, and it was a truck, once again, it was a Ford Ranger underneath, just shortened down, and it had, a proper little SUV shell on it. It was very capable off-road, partially due to its short wheelbase and extreme maneuverability. It was relatively light on its toes, although it didn't have the best power plant. There were two engines mainly available. There was actually a third, but the two engines were both Cologne V6s. The first one was measly, put out like 115 horsepower. It was a 2.8 with a carburetor, and then later a 2.9 that was fuel injected, put out like 140, which was better. They had everything from 3-speed automatics to 5-speed manual transmissions. The first generation actually came standard with 4-wheel drive, and then later on they had a rear-wheel drive version which became part of the mix. And initially they were locking front hubs manual, and then later on they became shift on the fly. It was an interesting little rig. Once again, most components were shared with the Ford Ranger. That includes the 7.5-inch rear end, the 28 spline rear axle, the Dana 28s up front. It was small. Yep, it was a small little truck. Okay, so let's get to the negatives real quick. Consumer Reports, among other people and organizations out there, said that it was an unsafe vehicle, especially for cornering. They did tend to tip. They were very tippy. I know this because I actually had one. The wrecking yard I worked at as a kid and a young adult actually gave me one of those to drive around, so I drove it for a while. Fortunately, it had aftermarket tires and wheels, which were wider, and it did help a little bit with cornering, but it was a little top heavy, and it had a really narrow, very short wheelbase, which was great for parking and great for maneuvering off-road, but it was a little iffy when it came to things like high-speed corners. Now, there was an option for limited slip rear diff. They did have some neat little packages, an Eddie Bauer package. They did change it up a little bit, so there was really two different generations, but primarily it was just some aesthetics that changed. For the most part, the biggest issue, other than the fact that it had some stability issues, was the fact that it just didn't have a lot of power. Now, the good news is that it turns out a 302 will fit beautifully in that engine bay. And a lot of people do conversions to swap them over to 302s, which really does make up a lot of the issues that they suffered from, power being one of them. And then from there, updating the suspension and the axles and everything else will suddenly give you a very capable little off-roader. There's there's a good-sized community out there of people who modify these little trucks and make them really capable off-road. And right now, the community for collection, it's not a big deal. In other words, they're cheap. So this message came from somebody in Southern California, well, near Southern California. So I checked in just the Los Angeles area alone and looked around, and I found examples for sale between $1,500 all the way up to about $6,500. And the one that was $6,500 had low mileage and was remarkably clean. I'm not saying to go out and buy these vehicles. You really need to drive it around and you'll understand what I mean about it being a little bit on the cheap side, but for some people, they can't think of a better truck. They absolutely want one of these. And other people, not so much. It's not a big collectible yet, is my point, and that means they're super inexpensive out there. So maybe grab a couple of those, keep one for parts, and see what happens in a few years, because when the new Bronco comes out, it's entirely possible that the popularity of older Broncos, including the Bronco II, may increase. Speaking of the old Bronco, and this is why they're kind of related, Ford announced a while ago that the Bronco will be built in Wayne, Michigan, next to the Ford Ranger. And on top of that, they announced that it'll have many of the same components that the Ranger has. Sound familiar? That's right. It's the same type of formula, which is great for you guys because that means that a lot of the tech has already been done. They already know what works and what doesn't. It also means we know some of the basics about what's going into the vehicle. Type of axles it has, what type of engine it may have, transmission, the 10-speed, and all that other stuff. And then from there, we could speculate going further and further whether or not they'll have a twin turbocharged V6 or even the Coyote V8 and a whole bunch of other things that people are dreaming about. So, at least for the interim, what we know is that it will be built in Wayne, Michigan. It will be built on a lot of the components that the Ford Ranger has. And so far from what we've seen in the pictures, it looks like there's a few different varieties out there. A beefy off-roady version and a not so off-roady version. That's all we've seen because there's a lot of photos and whatnot out there showing test vehicles going through various stages of testing, and some of them have some cladding on them, some have none whatsoever. The truck looks really cool, and I'm really excited about the idea of getting one, when we will too, by the way. We will be driving one, hopefully soon. Ford hasn't announced yet when press events are going to start or when we're going to receive one. However, all indications seem to point to just a few weeks to a month or so before we actually hear something. So I'm excited. Anyway, going back to this one final point about the Ford Bronco II and the new Bronco, yes, they are kind of sort of related when you look at their relationship to the Ford Ranger, which is cool. Now, the last question I have here is about the Ford Bronco Sport. Remember, that is a completely different vehicle than the new Ford Bronco. Ford Bronco Sport is based on the Ford Escape platform. It's a front-wheel drive biased vehicle. It is a crossover, and I think the whole purpose of it is it's giving people who really wanted the Ford Bronco a compromise, because a lot of them aren't going to go off-road, or a lot of them don't need a truck-based hardcore vehicle, but they want something that kind of gives them a little bit of that. So, he wanted to know two things. One, will there be a pickup truck version? And two, if it's going to be off-road capable. All right, so this comes directly from Ford. When I was asking them about, and they couldn't tell me very much, when I was asking them about the upcoming Ford Bronco Sport, back then we didn't know it was called the Sport, by the way, they did say that they were building a vehicle, a crossover, that would be extremely capable off-road. That's all they could tell me. No word on the all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive system they're going to be using, but the way Ford has been playing it, they don't like losing. So it's a really good chance that they're going to be very competitive with the Jeep Compass, Renegade, and even the Cherokee. Those vehicles that's kind of swimming around the Ford Bronco Sport in terms of its size and I think capability. Judging by what I've seen so far, just in terms of ground clearance, it's entirely possible it could be a very competitive vehicle. And I'm truly hoping that Ford sticks to that and makes this thing a real competitor, because it'll force other competitors to up their game. Now, in terms of a pickup truck, yes, very interesting. Just recently, we got an image that was sent to us, TFL truck, showing the tailgate for a vehicle that looks like it's going to be called the Maverick. Now, we know for a fact that Ford recently dug that name and pulled it back from history. Maverick used to be a car, and now they're putting it into what we think is a truck or a pickup utility. It looks entirely possible that Ford will be taking a bed and grafting it onto the back of the Ford Bronco Sport, building an inexpensive pickup utility vehicle that will slot underneath the Ford Ranger. See, we came back to the Ranger yet again. That means that if they decide to do this, they'll have a small pickup on the market. Now, notice I didn't say pickup truck. I find it different to say utility, a pickup utility, kind of like the Honda Ridgeline that some of you guys love and some of you guys hate. Look, I don't call the Ridgeline a truck, I call it a utility because it's a utility vehicle with a bed. It's just extremely utilitarian. And that's exactly what this could be as well. Not only that, but if Ford really does stick to this formula of making a very capable crossover in terms of off-roading, then imagine what a small pickup version of this would be like. It could be very cool. So we do have that story on TFL Truck and TFLnow in regards to the Ford Maverick, or the possible Ford Maverick. Okay guys, so thank you again for joining me. I hope this was enjoyable for you as it was for me, and for those of you who really didn't get much out of it, you know what? I wouldn't watch the next episode. You'll feel better about it. As for the rest of you, please stay safe and stay sane. For the Fastlane Car, Truck, Now, Classics, and Off-Road, this is Nathan. I'll see you guys next time.